really an honor, and it was, in the beginning, an honor to be the first Professor-At-Large at TNAU, and now you invited me to do the inaugural Centenary Lecture, so it's sort of a double honor. I noticed the introduction saying I had been associated with Cornell University for a very long time. And I said to my colleague here, they've been saying my association has been there for they've been saying that for a very long time. So, you know, it's kind of exponential by now. But let me get started here. What I want to do today is first, you know, provide a brief tribute to Dr. Swaminathan, who, you know, and Dr. Borlaug. I got to know Dr. Swaminathan through Dr. Borlaug. So that's my first point. Then I want to start talking about plant breeding and the importance of it to adapt to climate change, especially talk about productivity, total factor productivity. I don't know if I'm a little nervous, there might be an economist in the audience, but anyway, I think it's important. It's important for plant breeders to understand what it is, and to substantiate the need for a vigorous public plant breeding sector to improve total factor productivity. Discuss the implications of globalization and these disruptive technologies that are coming at us at a pretty rapid speed. And then talk about the advantages of adapting to climate change through plant breeding, including some of the emerging opportunities. And finally, try to portray the future of plant breeding in the context of climate change and especially artificial intelligence. So, you know, you all know more about Dr. Swaminathan than I do. But let me just emphasize the big hallmark in his career that he and Dr. Borlaug, who are pictured in the center here back in the 1960s, I reckon that photo would have been made. And I think they did something together that probably neither of them could have done alone. And that was that between 1964 and 1968, they doubled the yield of wheat in India. Just imagine that. You know, wheat had been grown in this region for what? 40 centuries. Since Mohenjo-Daro, you know, we know it had been grown. And so what had been done in 40 centuries was done again in 4 years. So it's absolutely amazing what the two of them achieved together. And, you know, I was around Dr. Borlaug a lot in my younger years, and then again, well, throughout his whole career after I got to know him, but mostly in being trained under him as his PhD student, his only PhD student. And he would talk a lot about Dr. Swaminathan. And, you know, I think he felt when he received I was in the field with him when he received the Nobel Prize. And I think he felt strongly that, you know, Dr. Swaminathan should have been a partner. What drove him to establish the World Food Prize was so that he could really acknowledge what Dr. Swaminathan contributed to that effort. So he had, you know, really tremendous respect, as did so many of us, for Dr. Swaminathan. So I spent, you know, about 40 years with Dr. Borlaug. That's me there in the left side when I was 26 years old or something, and still had hair, as you can see. That's that photo. You know, I don't have many photos from that era because, you know, a 35 millimeter camera back in the 1960s was worth a lot of money, and a graduate student couldn't afford one. And so I don't have many photos, but this photo was taken at my final exam for the PhD, and it was more like a press conference than a final exam because Dr. Borlaug came to town to participate in the exam. He came to Ithaca for the exam, and you know, the press came from all over, from Syracuse, some from New York City, just to interview him, and so they kept interrupting. So I didn't really mind, you know. They graduated me, so it was a fairly easy day for me. And then you know, I was with him toward the end of his career when we did together the Borlaug Global Rust Initiative. And you know, Dr. Borlaug, I wish I had more pictures of him with Dr. Swaminathan. There's some here from India, but they're mostly in the Punjab, where he was early focused with wheat. But he you know, he would always say to us, more than any other expression, take it to the farmer. His focus was always the farmer, and I have always remembered that, as have I think most people who were ever associated with him. So, coming to plant breeding, you know, we had a famous astronomer at Cornell by the name of Carl Sagan. Some of you who are have a few years of experience might remember him talking about the billion. He had a very deep voice, and he would talk about the billions and billions of this and that in outer space. So he used to say that, you know, if you're going to bake an apple pie, you had to first create the universe. So I've modified that to say, if you want to explain plant breeding from scratch, you have to first create the universe. So I want to explain plant breeding to you, maybe in a way you have never heard it portrayed, but, you know, in the context of our greater society, what does it do? And I think it's important for us as plant breeders and associated scientists to, you know, communicate this. So imagine yourself, you know, way out in space, 1 million light years, and you know, our solar system, well, our galaxy is just a sort of a glow in the very far distance. And imagine you come in an order of magnitude to 1 million light years, and you can see the galaxy and where the Earth is located. And then I'm not going to do the order of magnitude. I'll jump a few orders and come into 100,000 kilometers, where you can, you know, begin to see the real outline, the blue marble of the Earth. And if you come on in by an order of magnitude to 10,000 kilometers and 1,000 kilometers, I'm sorry this is going to zero in on Andhra instead of time, because that's where I first did it, but, you know, I didn't have time to change it. So the Earth at 100 kilometers, at 10 kilometers, and then what do you see? Well, you see fields. They're kind of sparse in Andhra, but they're what we call fields. But what are they really? What they really are biological solar panels. You know, we live on this third rock from the Earth, and this is the way we get our energy, from the sun. And what plant breeders do is improve the elements in those solar panels. That's what we do. And that, in my opinion, is a real contribution to total factor productivity, because we, you know, without So total factor productivity, let's just discuss what that is. It reflects the total economic cost of production, without subsidies or anything. It raises output per unit input. That can be like per hectare, per worker, per unit of water, reducing inputs per unit of output, or adding value with constant prices. So plant breeding contributes to all of that by, manipulating the elements that collect radiant energy from the sun. So it's, my case is it's a essential public-private investment. And there's a new study out by USDA that, in fact, total factor productivity is the major driver of output growth. And if you look closely at this slide, the light green area are the changes in productivity. You go back to the 1960s, you don't see much, but just imagine Swaminathan and Borlaug's contribution to the productivity of wheat by the fact that through plant breeding, they doubled what had been there for the past 40 centuries. So that was probably the first really huge contribution. And we've gone on since then to add this amount of productivity to output growth. And I think we need to really recognize that and focus on it as plant breeders. So here's, land area has remained virtually constant for the last several decades. But genetics, technology, and management, this is mostly genetics, has added greatly to the production and the productivity. So this is a summary then. A vigorous plant breeding sector is required to adapt to climate change because it increases this conversion of solar energy to increase total factor productivity. It reduces the costs, both monetary and environmental, of plant protection, insecticides, fungicides, and so forth. Effective plant breeding reduces that a lot. It adds value for quality, sensory, nutritional factors. It helps enhance the production of biofuels and improve the sustainability of agricultural systems. So the threat of climate change, let's just talk about it a minute. What's happening? You see this kangaroo riding a bale of hay in Australia. That's a real photo. But you see this graph, and I hope it's a little dim, but what this is are, 1-year portrayals beginning in 1940 at the bottom, and each year since 1940 portrays a year going across the bottom. So what's happened recently? Look at what happened last year. The tremendous increase. And then the beginning of this year, it started off high. I don't have the data to know where it's finishing, but I'm thinking it's finishing high. So we really have a tremendous problem with temperature rising. And these are the trends in land and ocean temperature. I'm sure you know that it's getting, the change is greater in the polar regions than it is at the lower latitude. But, the significance is it's getting hotter. This is causing Right now, we have a tremendous, I don't know if you keep up with any of the U.S. news, but we just had a hurricane that went into the eastern mountains of North Carolina. Incredible damage, just absolutely incredible. People, you know, those are little valleys where the road is always built along the side of the stream. That's the only place you can build a road. And it rained in those areas up to 30 inches in a matter of a couple of days, 30 inches. So it just, you know, tore through that region. And it's, you know, it's happened in Eastern Europe quite recently. These pictures here are from Germany a couple of years ago when I first made this slide. We have raging fires in California. So I think there's very little argument about the changes that are taking place. The permafrost is probably one of the most dangerous things that is happening, and you know, no one really thinks about talking about it, but I understand that President Putin is actually importing American cowboys to, you know, graze cattle in these areas that used to be permafrost. The pastures are opening up in Central Asia. It's really quite amazing. So climate change is real, and generally they tell us that rainfall will increase because the hot air holds more water. It'll decrease in lower latitudes, increase in higher latitudes. But, you know, an important thing is there's going to be a lot more variance, and major changes are going to occur in the distribution of plant diseases and insect pests. So just an example, heat versus wheat. You know, I work pretty closely with CIMMYT. They've been running trials for some years, and their conclusion is that for every 1 degree centigrade rise in night temperature, wheat yield is reduced by a metric ton per hectare. This is really quite a serious thing. So, you know, we're already in trouble with wheat. Rice, you know, rice, well, in this state, half of humanity eats it. It's threatened by heat, by drought, by flooding, by salinity, by diseases and pests. These big river deltas, this is the Mekong. You know, when in the introduction you said I'd been working, or it became clear I've been working quite a while. Well, I first saw the Mekong River in 1972, and it was all rice. Now, 50 years later, what has happened? You can still see some rice there on the right, but on the left in that big horseshoe bend of the river, it's flooded, obviously. So you might just think it's flooded out from the saline water pushing up through there, and that's true. But what they're doing in that saline water is growing shrimp and making a lot of money, actually. So, you know, in some ways there can be positive things. Farmers in that region are making more money growing and selling shrimp than they were growing and selling rice. But it's frightening what sea rise means for rice cultivation. I was just talking to one of your colleagues, Dr. Hari Haran, about what he's doing. It's, you know, really interesting work in coping with salinity tolerance in these big coastal delta areas. So challenges for plant breeding in society. You have the globalization of agriculture, privatization of, you know, major crops, these multinational seed companies, international trade, international flow of labor, social resistance to some of the technologies, climate change impact on the developing world, the automation of agriculture and plant breeding, alternate sources of animal protein. That looks like a change that could really affect U.S. agriculture, which is, produces corn and soybeans, which are mainly used to feed poultry and other livestock. And importantly, we need to do a better job of communication of the fundamental societal need for plant breeding, for adapted genotypes that are based on the value of these technologies that we've developed. I like to show a single seed, the potential that it is there for modifying the code in a single seed is really extraordinary. But crop improvement has changed more in the past 20 years than at any time since the discovery of genetics. And it continues to change. I've probably been saying that for 20 years. It's really changing fast. It's driven by discoveries in biology and information technology. It's accelerated by laws protecting or patenting biological material. And it's going to be catalyzed by artificial intelligence. So how will AI, artificial intelligence, impact plant breeding? A few big companies and perhaps a few large universities have a comparative advantage in the form of very large proprietary databases that they have on performance. If you take some of the big companies, they've been testing throughout the world for decades. And they have access to extraordinary computing capacity, which is essential. So we need to think seriously about what that implies. Here's a graph of the changes in computing capacity, and it just keeps going, still doubling every 18 months or so. It's actually quite amazing. They measure it in flops, and it's grown to a level of 140,000 trillion flops. So, such is the demand for computing power that the chair of Microsoft has suggested to the U.S. government that they should reopen 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island is a nuclear power plant that was closed down maybe 20 years ago because of some, social pressure and maybe real hazards. But he's saying that, that kind of power will be needed for the computers to drive artificial intelligence. I think we really have a lot to learn about what's going to happen with artificial intelligence. So that, people who think deeply about this subject, about artificial intelligence, they have not thought about plant breeding, but they have thought generally about it, about AI and its likely impact on any field of endeavor. And what they say is that the likelihood is that state-of-the-art activity will coalesce in just a few places, just a few, So you have to ask yourself, if you're situated wherever, will this be one of them? And the answer is probably not. I can say at Cornell, we might be one of them. We have, one of the 5 great supercomputers in the country, but I don't know if in the fullness of time it can compete with what may, coalesce in other locations. So whoever comes along with this capacity is going to prevail, and we have a lot to learn about the implications, a lot to learn about. You should be thinking about, what will be relevant partnerships if this kind of thing happens. We all should be thinking, because it's an incredibly challenging thing. So, but you can't, we don't want to overlook the fact that you can't understand in a lab how technology and society are going to evolve. We have the experience already to say that there can be a lot of social resistance to these technologies. While I was at TNAU, we lamented about the BT eggplant. 20 years ago, we tried to deploy it in Tamil Nadu, in Karnataka, and in Bangladesh, and in Maharashtra, but we only succeeded ultimately in Bangladesh. And it's working. It works great, and it's leaking over into India. I don't know how much or exactly where, but I know it's happening. And that's because it really works. It really does work, and it's absolutely of no danger to human beings, and it eliminates the fruit and shoot borer as a damaging insect on eggplant. So it's a shame that didn't work, but we can only try again. What we can say, so we can't understand, we can't predict what the pushback will be, and we can say that AI is still not good at reasoning, but it's, superhuman in terms of global knowledge. It can access your data and do tasks that you could never do. Never could the human mind get around what AI can do and learn with these large volumes of data that are available to it. So what are the consequences of these changes? Concerns that expansive patenting may inhibit the involvement of the public sector and jeopardize contributions to the welfare of people. Concerns that a few companies may gain control of the global food system. Companies like Syngenta, Bayer, Corteva, and then of course there's fear of biodiversity exploitation. What about AI and copyright? That's complicated. A lot of opponents, like the New York Times, for instance. New York Times has filed a lawsuit saying, AI does not have the right to learn from the New York Times. And the proponents are saying that if humans can read the internet and learn, then AI should be able to read the internet and learn. So, I've asked sort of sarcastically, will AI successfully defend AI? I think there are a lot of answers that we really don't know. So trends in crop improvement. Private sector breeders are increasing, public sector breeders decreasing, which is unfortunate. We should, all do our best to do something about that. Public sector is not producing finished cultivars. Public resources are diverted to basic science. Climate change is definitely more challenging. Transgenic crops are expanding. Edited cultivars are expanding. Alternate approaches to protein production and public skepticism is significant, but lately it's been improving. So genomics, we're all aware of it. It's an ongoing revolution comparable to physics in the last century. All genes encoding most major life forms are being revealed. It's a major paradigm shift in biological research. So I'm not going to get into the details of genomics except to say that we are using it to improve cassava in Africa. We have had this project now for just over 10 years, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Cassavas are really what breeders have always called a recalcitrant crop. It's vegetatively propagated, it's genetically very heterogeneous, so you cross two desirable cultivars, but it just, doesn't give you anything. It just throws a bunch of junk. So we can get around that with phenotype, with sequencing individual plants, using those data to plan crosses. We've been able to get 10% a year genetic gain over the past 10 years or so. So it's really working, so much so that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has identified this program as one of the 5 things that make them optimistic about Africa. So we're quite proud of that, and we should all be aware that genomic selection does work, and we need the resources to apply it more broadly. I mentioned the BT fruit and shoot borer resistant eggplant, and that represents a whole category of technology that we should be using more effectively, but society has made it a challenge for us. Genome editing is coming. I know some of you are utilizing it here successfully. I think it has a great future, and there's real hope that the social resistance to it will be a lot less than it has been to transgenics. So, thinking of the past, plant breeding has accounted for more than half the gains in production in agriculture in this century. Success was based on an implicit contract that genetic resources were public and available to anyone. But over the past several years, the rules have changed. In some cases you have kind of draconian institutions that have emerged to protect biodiversity, and they're really getting in the way of the exchange of germplasm and productive plant breeding. Imagine, what would have happened back in the days of Swaminathan and Borlaug if we had this kind of constraint. Dr. Swaminathan first saw Dr. Borlaug's varieties in an international rust nursery up in Wellington, a station that Dr. Swaminathan helped to contribute or establish, I believe. So back then, we exchanged. I became a rice breeder after training with Dr. Borlaug. We set up the International Rice Testing Program. We exchanged germplasm freely with everyone, everywhere in Asia. Now, that's a very challenging thing to do. So I think it's something we need to reflect on and improve if we can. So the future. First, plant breeding will integrate fully with agricultural research specifically and with biological, engineering, and medical research generally. You're going to have an interdependent public-private sector, and plant breeding will be a primary force in adapting to climate change. The public sector will be the dominant partner for training. The private sector will be the dominant partner for research. The private sector will continue to consolidate. new startups like Pairwise is one that I'm familiar with in the U.S. It's doing transgenics for fresh vegetables. So new startups may be more frequent, especially for fruit and vegetable crops. The public sector will increasingly partner with the private sector, haves, I call them. And these are the big companies. And they'll find it challenging to serve the have-nots. Adaptation to climate change will require increasing attention from plant breeders. AI may lead to further consolidation due to the enormous computing requirements that we talked about earlier. So the winners and losers, consumers may enjoy lower food prices. For seed companies, size will matter. Producers may suffer as more value is added through genetic technology and less through management. But companies may assist with management, particularly data management. So, I think we've not seen anything yet. The gene editing, gene drive, all this, CRISPR really has, I think, a lot of potential for a lot of crops. So in summary, plant breeding is essential to ensure the adaptation to climate change. An improved economy and strengthened employment through increased exports are among the advantages of adapting crops. Communicating, Dr. Borlaug and Dr. Swaminathan, they were both in their own way really effective communicators. I've more frequently observed Dr. Borlaug, he could communicate with anybody. I mean, he's famous for communicating with politicians, but he never passed up a chance. You go to the field with him and first thing you say, "Where's Borlaug?" Well, he's over talking to the boy that scares off the birds, and spends the whole day in the field. He's chatting him up and he's finding out what goes on around there and, making a friend of him. He was really an amazing man. So communicating is a real fundamental need that all of us as scientists really need to do a better job at. So shaped by unprecedented technological and economic forces, change is accelerating, and automation is moving especially fast. Interdependence is increasing between the public and private sector. Interdependence is increasing among nations for access to genomic technologies for crop improvement. International partnerships are essential for access to germplasm, but it's very challenging to implement them right now. So climate change will demand increased attention from plant breeders to address the challenges that we've discussed: drought, flooding, salinity, diseases and pests, increasing cost of water. When I was a student, the risk was calculated by hazard times exposure. That was what we were taught was the risk. Now it's hazard times the media exposure equals the perception of risk, right? That's the way it's working. So, my final, I guess, Borlaug, I think, was our greatest example of what I would call a man-on message. He could really, speak to anybody about the science he was doing. You all are too young to remember it, but in the day, when those short-statured varieties came out, people were just as suspicious of those things as they are of today's modern technologies. They thought it was just, not right that wheat should be that short. Something must be wrong with it, Will it make you sterile or whatever? I was with Borlaug once in Pakistan at a press conference, and a guy asked him, a newspaper person asked him, "Is it true, Dr. Borlaug, that these varieties will make you sterile?" And Borlaug, he was very frustrated, He said, "I wish the hell it would," which solved the population problem. So he was a great communicator, and I think we should all take that as an example and do our best to explain our science and explain the needs that society has for these technologies. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to take some questions if there are some.